Coming up on episode 4 of Project RS125.
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to turn into a puddle of metal at the moment, but also not really a lot's happening.
Ooh la la, so fresh and so clean. Well, unfortunately, they have rotted through. Lost a little bit to the environment there. Those that saw the previous episode, there was a lot of grease and grime on that rear wheel and swing arm, and I needed to get the rest of it off. So the auto clean was good, but a lot of you in the comments said WD-40 was a good suggestion, and I would agree because I've used it before to make my R1M wheels really pop. The problem is it's not the most aggressive, which is good if you don't want to damage the materials, but at the same time it's not brilliant for removing everything you're trying to get off. It did make a big improvement, as you can see here in the clips, but some suggestions for using petrol, which I have done in the past. Very powerful, is a good option. Does stink, so we're using a well ventilated area. And oven cleaner, mentioned more than once. So yeah, we give that a whirl, but we'll come back to that later in the video. Every time I was entering the garage, I would see that number plate and L plate. I don't know why it offended me so much, but I thought, you know what, this episode I need to finally get it removed. And as you would expect from an old bike, everything was rusty and seized. But what I didn't expect was a big sheet of steel to be sat there supporting the L plate. So I've got to have gained at least a little bit of power from the weight reduction so far. So whilst we're in the middle of taking everything apart, something I'd like to run past the RS125 expert. So we've got obviously this intake on the nose cone fairing, which brings cool air, as we've seen there, and then just sort of dumps it onto the top of the cylinder head, which for me doesn't seem like an optimum way of using that, in all honesty, because especially in the car world, and obviously even things like the Gixxer, the R1, they all have these intakes on the nose which feeds the airbox with cool air. Obviously having carburetor versus injection, I guess you could run it lean if you plumb that directly to the top of the airbox. So there is a modification you can do to this with spinning around the rubber so it gives a Venturi effect, which we're going to do. We'll come to that in another video. But something I have thought about is, because I think I've got some space here, is running some ducting just down to this part, because at the moment, let's lift this in, the standard airbox, I mean, it's just sort of there. It's just where the engine's going to be, hot air getting blown through from the radiator straight into that. It doesn't seem optimum to me, whereas if we run that feed to like there, so it's not pressurizing it, but it's bringing a good channel of cool air, seems like a logical move to me. But we'll come back to that in the next episode. Obviously, let me know, guys, what do you think? Worth doing? With my super idea of the airbox left to one side, it was time to take the rear of the bike apart. The subframe was looking pretty rotten, in all honesty, and in order to get it painted we were going to need to remove all the under tray, the regulator, the tail light loom, and as you can see here, more GT85 to try and get that rusted bolt undone. And it really was testing for something that should take a couple of minutes, but as always, part of the fun. I'm not really sure what's been sprayed into the CDI plug. I don't think it's a seal failure because there's no corrosion in there, but it's certainly something that shouldn't be in there, that's for sure. At this stage, I also started labelling the cables. Because I'm going to be making a race bike for the road, I'm not going to need a lot of things on this loom anymore, lights, etc. So it made sense to start identifying them before stripping it any further. The new engine runs a pre-mix setup, which means I will not have the use of the 2T oil tank, which is normally sat just under the rider's seat. And as you can see, I simply remove it, undrain it, and we've also got an oil level sensor in there, which we're not going to need. So with that labelled up, it's going to make life easy identifying what can be removed from the loom. So I've got to look into the jetting a bit more on the carb, actually brings me to that point that there's a lot of hearsay about you have to change the fuel in if you run pre-mix. I've heard such mixed stuff over the years. I think we're going to need to have a chat with the main man Paul at PGME about the best option in terms of jetting for that setup. With the 2-stroke oil tank safely out of the way, I then had to remove the latch setup, which holds the rider seat in place using the key. 4 bolts. And I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with this yet, because I don't need it in place for my race bike build, because there's not really going to be a situation where someone's going to be able to get under the seat. But with that done, the subframe can then be removed and get our first look at what needs to be done with the rest of the bike. As mentioned earlier in the series, I really like the way the RS125 has its frame and bracket supports for the side fairing. Really simple, nice and lightweight, and pleased to see on this one that they're all intact. So many of these that I was looking at when looking to buy one had all bits like this missing. So yeah, real credit to Ben, the previous owner. As can be seen here, given the age and the mileage, the rear brake didn't actually look too bad as I started taking it apart, and this is where things start to show problems, which can be headache, but thankfully we've got that Mark 1 RS125 donor part spikes that comes to the rescue. For the keen-eyed of you, have a look here and you can see unfortunately we've got a very slight crack in the rear set, which is annoying, but it's one of those things. These bikes got dropped when they were obviously owned by youngsters like myself back when I was 18, 19, and damage does occur and goes on unnoticed. But thankfully again, we have those replacement ones in my box of bits to save the day. Chuffed that I had a replacement in the box of parts, I continue on with the left hand side rear set. Pleased to report there's no damage on this one, and I continue with moving forward to take apart the rear braking system and get it on the bench so we can have our first look at what the new setup's going to be like.
So as you can see from the first RS125 I bought for that engine, we've also got some pretty tasty bits in here. I don't know what finish this is. It looks potentially painted, but essentially lovely looking rear caliper. Hell, my number one go-to for my brake stuff, for those who again have seen on the R1 video. We've got the new bolts and washers. EBC pads, I'm going to be honest, from past experience, they're not my go-to. I'm more of an SBS guy, but we've got them, so look, we're going to bang them in. We've got brand new seals, brand new bleed nipple. It's going to be looking a lot better than all this, hopefully. So yeah, let's start putting it all back together.
With the rear brake assembly completely removed from the bike, it made sense to drain the fluid. Even if I wasn't going to use the parts from this, I didn't really need anything leaking out into a box. And for those of you that don't know, brake fluid is pretty corrosive, so I don't want it stripping any paintwork off of anything left in storage. So with the vacuum bleeder in place, I could then undo the bleed nipple, pull that fluid out, which I think you'll agree was well past it, and certainly satisfying to see it come out of the system. Arguably the best bit for me, putting shiny bits back together. So let's take it away with this new caliper, or brand used, shall we say. So we'll quickly run through how a caliper's put together, and hopefully for those that have never seen it before, this will be quite interesting. So this is the rear caliper. It's a dual piston. As you saw there, we took it apart as it's a two-piece design, which generally people favour a one-piece. But the two-piece comes apart, 2 bolts, and inside there are some oil ways, or brake fluid oil ways. And essentially they are linked with that little O-ring that sits in there. When it clamps back together, it makes the complete circuit. So what we've got to do is put the pistons in. Now these were included with the kit. They've actually cleaned up really nicely, which is handy, so we can reuse them. And it came with a brand new genuine Aprilia set. So these are the dust seals, these are the actual seals, this is for the bleed nipple cover, and that's that seal that goes between the two parts of the caliper. And as you can probably see here, hopefully on camera, we've got a hole there and a hole there, which links to that hole and then through that side. And essentially those 2 holes, you have your brake hose and your bleed nipple, but it allows the circuit to link. And what will happen is when the circuit is closed from the bleed nipple, wherever that is, over there somewhere, it will allow, when the brake pedal is pressed, for these to be pushed out, which will then move the brake pads onto the brake disc. So yeah, hopefully a little insight, but we're going to put that back together because we've got new seals. This has been cleaned up, these have cleaned up lovely, and fingers crossed we can make a half decent looking kit out of this. Before even getting started on assembling the rear brakes, I wanted to make sure everything was as clean as possible, and using my trusty brake and clutch cleaner, I gave everything a good soak in to make sure there's nothing in the brake fluid channel ways where we're going to be putting everything back together. Now I've had this tub of red grease for absolutely years, and it's perfect for assembling pistons into calipers.
With the pistons happily seated in the dust seals inside the caliper, it was time to get the two halves together. Now you need to be really careful with the little O-ring between the two, because if you pinch it or it drops during assembly, it's just going to leak brake fluid absolutely everywhere. And as mentioned, if it gets on things like wheels, bodywork, it's going to make a right mess. So I really took my time with this, and then once I was happy that it was all together, the two bolts go in, and then you torque all the caliper together to make sure it's nice and secure, and then we can move on to the next step. I pulled the bleed nipple out of the old caliper just to give you a quick comparison as to how bad the one was in the old bike. With the caliper removed, you can see the corrosion, and look at the state of that rear brake pad. God knows what the disc was like that was being used on. Ideally, I would have liked to have replaced the pad retaining clips, but I didn't have any in the kit, and I certainly wasn't going to wait weeks and weeks for one to arrive from Aprilia. We all know how bad that can be, trying to get parts outside of the UK, especially from Italian manufacturers typically. So made the decision to wire brush everything and got the little file out just to clean it up. This build isn't going to be a full factory finish, you know, never seen daylight looking thing. I want to ride this bike, I'm not precious about it. Obviously I don't want it to look crap, but at the same time it doesn't need to be a show bike. It's not winning any show and shines. It's going to be a great bit of fun for me to go ripping around on some back roads. For those that watch the Aprilia RSV series, they'll know how much I love ACF 50. So I treated the raw components that we just wire brushed and sanded down to just a little coat to help any prevention of corrosion. And as you can see, it did wonders for the plastic caliper cover as well. With the caliper now assembled, it was time to get the new EBC pads in place, and as I'm sure you'll agree, it certainly looks a damn sight better than the red caliper that was on the bike previously. The next job was getting the Hell rear braided brake line in place using the copper washers, and as can be seen here, so much smarter and cleaner than a rubber hose, even when the rubber hoses are brand new. With that in place, using the old caliper to mark the position so that I knew which direction the hoses need to be in, I could then install the master cylinder. And as you'll probably note from the master cylinder on the old bike, it has a pressure switch in it, which is slightly different to what I'll be running, as I'll be running a daytime MOT. I'm not going to need rear brake lights because there won't be any on the bike, so I didn't need to refit the pressure switch that comes as standard with the RS125. Annoyingly, I didn't have any rubber hose on the shelf to replace the reservoir hose to the master cylinder, but the good news is it did clean up really nicely and finished off with the new gold zinc plated clips. Looked the part when it was all back together. Much to my surprise, the brake reservoir pot cleaned up really well, just with a little bit of brake cleaner. I'd seen tips with using bleach, which is, I can't even remember the name of it. It's what hairdressers use, chloride, something, I don't know. But it's meant to strip back these pure white. But as hopefully you can see, it cleaned up like new anyway, with just a bit of trusty brake and clutch cleaner. With all my new shiny bits ready, the final piece of the puzzle was simply attaching the reservoir to the master cylinder, again using the new clips. And as hopefully you can see, this is the old system versus the new one. What a difference.
So I use one of these cans to dispense brake and clutch cleaner, which is my go-to around the workshop. Unfortunately, the pit under there is pretty damp, and
The cans that I store that in, which I might add is not particularly cheap, have rotted through, resulting in me losing about 5 litres of the damn stuff. So, yeah, not ideal, as we're now having to use some water bottles to store it all. Balls.
So as mentioned in the introduction, a few of you mentioned in the comments, give oven cleaner a whirl, and I didn't cheap out on this either. I bought the premium Mr. Muscle, so I thought I'm going to use something that I'm not too precious about. Obviously that bent rear set was an ideal candidate, and stripped all the bits off of it because I'm going to need bits like the foot peg, the push rod for the rear master cylinder. Just strip it down to the basic bits and essentially cover it in Mr. Muscle and leave it. Now the instructions say half an hour. I thought, do you know what, I'm not really too bothered about its condition. I want to see the max strength of this. If we need to leave it longer, we will do. But while we were doing that, I went back on to working on the handlebars. Bizarrely, the handlebar controls seem different between the two models that I've got, but this isn't a big issue, and I had some new grips, some new bar ends, all to get fitted. So essentially with the Mark 1 RS125 that I bought, the stoner bike that came with all the parts, and brand new clip-ons were included, which made sense to use these because we knew they were going to be straight, whereas as we've seen from this one with the bent rear set, there's a good chance this clip-on could also be bent if it's gone over on its side. So I needed to strip all the parts down and try and work out as well why the system was loose on the handlebars, like the control module was wiggling about, almost like it was loose but it was tight. But we come back to that later in the episode. The first job was removing the master cylinder, and as you can see here, that dust seal was looking past its best for sure. One large 8mm Allen key holds the clip-on in place to the top yoke. Pretty straightforward to undo. You can then release the bar from the top yoke assembly, undo the throttle assembly which holds the throttle cable and throttle tube, undo the wiring, and then we're free to start fitting the new grips on the bench. The old clip-on actually looked in pretty good order, bar some surface corrosion. So I started work on cleaning everything down and getting ready to fit the new grip to the throttle tube. Past videos you may have seen I've used glass cleaner, which works as a nice lubricant but also dries without leaving any residue, whereas if you use oil or anything like that, the grip is always going to slide on the tube, so it's not really suited. It's still a struggle even with the glass cleaner. As you can see here, I spent a good 10 minutes tossing off the throttle grip to get it in place, but the end result, yep, we're chuffed with that. I loosely refit the throttle housing onto the clip-on, and I'm going to be honest with you, there's a little bit of a bodge in there that's causing the movement, so we'll have to come back to that in the next video. But I have semi-approached with the assembly so that you can have a good look of the finished piece, and I love the original bar ends on the bike. Well, that wraps up the video, guys and girls. Hope you enjoyed. If so, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help me grow the channel and allow for more of these projects. And as you can see here, yeah, I think we're going to say the oven cleaner was a bit of a fail in all honesty. Yeah, it softened it, maybe loosened it, but personally I think petrol would have destroyed that. So we'll have a go on the next one with some petrol and a brush and see how much better we can get it with some trusty unleaded. Until next time, thanks for watching.